Good morning, and it's lovely to be able to talk to the 1152 Club again. I'm sorry it's not in person, but hopefully we will be able to start having an audience soon. So today I thought I would just give you a little bit of a window onto what we've been doing to revamp the 20th century and 21st century toy displays at Abbey House Museum, some of which we've been trying to do while we've been closed. The galleries are now open to the public, but we haven't quite finished all of our new interpretation and new designs. So you'll be able to see the objects, but it's not a completely finished gallery. So if you want to hold fire in terms of visiting to see everything that's ready, we'll be publicising that when it's all absolutely ready to go. Basically, we have two areas of toy displays at Abbey House Museum. One was the highly designed area around the theme of nursery rhymes that we opened with after the big refurbishment of Abbey House Museum in 2001. And that looks at the period between about 1810 and 1910. And since then, we've been trying to sort of expand the toy gallery, childhood gallery, to cover later periods and actually the bit of childhood that we all none of us were born in the 19th century. So the most recent displays aim to look at things that are more in living memory, and one of the remits we had for the gallery was really to have that sort of wow and nostalgic factor of people being able to hopefully recognise toys that they played with when they were children. So this is a picture of the displays that we've just taken out. Some of the objects will still be there, but we did this redisplay on the theme of girls and boys' toys. There was a room of boys' toys and a room of girls' toys. This was done in about 2012, so it had been up for nearly 9 years, and it was definitely time for a change. But you've got exactly the same space and the same display cases. Now, one of the things that we are really looking forward to, we have had new designs for wallpaper and also blinds, where we've worked with the artist Jackie Fleming. And Jackie Fleming worked with us on various projects at Abbey House. She's already designed the wallpaper that we have in the dressing up area down in the street, and we worked with her wonderfully in the exhibition in 2018 called A Woman's Place, where she did some wonderfully witty cartoon illustrations to help bring that exhibition alive. So we were delighted when she was happy to work with us on producing some artwork that would be on the walls in the exhibition. This is one of the things that hasn't yet been installed, but we're hoping to be able to sort that out very soon, and we certainly have it all ready to go. And one of the things that we wanted Jackie Fleming's illustrations to do was to bring alive, in a sense, bring children into the gallery. We have a lot of toys and games on display, but obviously we can't put children in cases. So really, it's a way of trying to bring the aspect of children and play, and that toys are all about play and interaction, into the gallery. And here is a design that she's done for one of the blinds, and she's meant to has produced lots of little vignettes of childhood. She works often on things based on photographs, but also she was asking for inspiration from the actual museum collections as well. Although we did tell her that we didn't need her to just draw objects that we already have on display, because obviously you'll be able to see them, and what we wanted was to bring in, I suppose, more aspects of things like playground play. So in the new displays, we've dealt with them a little bit more thematically, and there are areas you might think would still fall into this category of girls' toys and boys' toys. In particular, dolls traditionally considered something that are very much in the domain of girls, learning how to sort of nurture and have, their own little baby to look after, or dolls that they're expected to dress up in the latest fashion so that they can practice being fashionable. And obviously, probably the majority of the dolls in our collection were owned by girls. We've got a couple of examples here. The doll on the left there was bought at Hitchens in 1947, and it's really quite a high-end prestige doll because it's a walkie-talkie doll, so she walks and apparently says "mama" when tilted. Now the doll on the right is one that is known as a Topsy Doll, and this is quite common in sort of from about the 1920s to 1950s. There were a lot of dolls produced representing black babies, and they were tended to be called Topsy after the character of the slave girl in the novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe, Uncle Tom's Cabin. And they're really quite an interesting phenomenon. They would have been largely owned probably by white children, but they've become quite collectible. And there's a really interesting sort of blog that I found recently called Black Doll Collecting, which does a little bit of analysis of this type of doll. Quite a lot of them do sort of try and represent the character as she was described in the novel, and she tends to have a sort of ribbon in her hair. I mean, I don't think any white doll would actually have been presented having pierced ears and earrings, so there's an element of the sort of exotic about the way they were represented, and we're looking at ways of trying to sort of interpret this sort of thing in the gallery. But of course, by not saying that it's girls and boys toys, we can say, well, definitively, the Action Man produced by Palitoy in the 1960s was very much aimed at boys, but it's also indisputably a doll. So we've been able to mix those up, and rather than having this Action Man was on display in the old display, but it was very much amongst the boys' toys. Now it's there sitting alongside all the other dolls in our display. One thing we're hoping the new display will be able to look at a little is issues around body image and the sexualization of dolls and how this has sort of developed over time. This is a really stark case in point. These are both examples of Cindy dolls. The one on the right is from 1971 and shows Cindy as a girl next door. But by 1988, the Cindy doll there is packaged fully in pink, and she has the absurd and impossible body proportions that are similar to that of her American rival Barbie. And this shows that the move towards marketing dolls and games at girls using a lot of pink and sparkly things is really quite a new phenomenon and isn't something that was always there in toy marketing. But there's also been quite a pushback on this, and I'm very interested in following organisations such as Let Toys Be Toys, which are trying to remove some of this more overt stereotyping and gender differentiation in toys. And this sort of I suppose, overt sexualization of dolls, which began with Barbie, also continues with dolls such as this is a Bratz doll, which was first launched in 2001 and very much aimed as being a sort of quite provocative teenage fashion doll with a lot of attitude, but it's still quite sexualized attitude, and they were really quite controversial. And this is an example that was made in 2013. So in order to address some of these issues of sort of really the commercial pressures and ideas, sort of stereotyped ideas of what is beautiful. There's been a move recently to create some more individualized dolls that represent the girls that would be buying them, and to give a lot more diversity. And actually, even Barbie, the big major player in the doll world, has been trying to address some of this recently, although I think their dolls are still very much on the same sort of general, slightly impossible, idealized form of sort of womanhood that they represent. So on the left we have a Lottie doll, who is based on a girl called Mia, and she is based on a girl who is a wildlife photographer. So she comes dressed in her denim blue hat and blue jeans and spotty wellies, and comes with a camera and the edition too of Branksy School News. And one of the important things that she wears a cochlear implant, so she is hard of hearing. And the doll on the right there is from a company that makes dolls called Our Generation, and this is Marlowe, and she is a girl who's represented with her guide dog and her various other things to do with the fact that she is partially sighted. So it says Marlowe is visually impaired and she relies on her loyal pal to help her guide her around the town. So with some of our sort of contemporary collecting around the displays in this gallery, we wanted to show some of these moves to try and make dolls a little bit more varied and inclusive. So this problem of stereotyped and derogatory representation can pop up in all sorts of areas of our collection. We've already discussed it in relation to the Topsy Doll. But with this board game, which we'd selected for display, it's Emil Littler's show business game. We'd selected it because of its has a link with Leeds, in that Emil Littler produced many of the pantomimes at the Leeds Empire Theatre and was a big name in show business. And it was only when I was putting this object on display that I looked at it closely enough and realised that behind the sort of bright yellow theatre lights on the stage, there are some pretty crude and insulting images of black musicians or blackface musicians. So this is something that we will still want to put on display, but we really do need to explain the context, including the history of blackface in theatre, and also the fact that it did reflect a lot of the condescending and racist attitudes of the time, linked to empire, and also some of the after effects of slavery in the United States, which were culturally influencing Britain as well. And we clearly have the same issue with this 1920s little Punch and Judy clockwork toy. There has always been a black character in Punch and Judy who was known as Jim Crow, or the Black Man. And Jim Crow itself has a lot of cultural associations with slavery and the post-slavery situation in the United States, that was also linked back again to colonial attitudes in England. But as I said, he's a stock character in Punch and Judy, and in this particular depiction, he's it's very crudely done. Obviously, Punch and Judy is problematic for people in many ways. It does appear in the plot to condone wife beating and also cruelty to children, amongst other things. This is reflected in the toys, but obviously Punch and Judy was also a big social phenomenon, very popular, and it's something that has adapted over the years and is still, a very culturally significant thing. We don't want to censor items like this, but we do want to make sure that we explain their context and try and address the themes through other items on display. So clearly, in this slide, we have an object which doesn't have so many problems with representation, but it was one of the themes when we had a boys and girls toys display. The boys toys were very transport heavy. We had a wonderful display of our very comprehensive collection of model railway models and other transport items. But this particular boat wasn't on display, but it is made actually by a local company called Sutcliffe Pressings, who made a lot of these model boats in the 1930s and 40s and were based in Horsforth. So it reflects another strand in the displays where we are trying to also showcase objects, toys that were made in the Leeds area. And in amongst the many sort of familiar commercial toys in the gallery, we also have included quite a number of things that were a bit more personal and homemade. And this is a battleship just made out of a block of wood that was made for a little boy called Michael Pitchforth. They're not sure whether it was by a family friend or possibly a relative, but he lived in Armley and it was given to him as a birthday present when he was a small boy around 1936. And this slide shows a couple of examples of toys in the display which reflect children's excitement and at the thrill of motor racing, and obviously toy cars, particularly ones with wheels that work, have always been very popular. The one on the left dates from about 1930 and is a very beautifully made and probably very expensive model based on a Talbot racing car. And on the right, we've got a 1970s toy made by, again, another local manufacturer, Dennis Fishel Toys, who were based at Thorpe Arch in Wetherby. And this is an example of one of their Revroid toys, which is a system that they invented, which uses a sort of ripcord mechanism to make the wheel spin very fast and let the car spin fast across the table. And obviously, we can't really look at transport without looking at one of the biggest transport innovations of the 20th century, which was obviously flight. And this really did excite children and toys. We have a lot of toy aeroplanes in the collection. One particularly wonderful collection we have was made by somebody called L.H. Fuller. As a boy, we don't have his full name, but he made a number of very careful aeroplane models during the Second World War. And we actually have a group of these on display in the Second World War case at the Leeds City Museum. And on the right is another toy aeroplane that would have been made by a child, but from a kit in this case. It's a plastic kit from the 1950s, and it represents a sort of airliner from BKS Air Transport Limited. So moving on from that, another case we looks at really the development, again, quite a 20th century development of toys and narratives around science fiction, the development of science fiction. And this is a wonderful radio set made by J and L Randall, who were based in Potter's Bar in the 1950s. And Dan Dare was a character who appeared in the Eagle comic story, which was titled Dan Dare, Pilot of the Future, and it appeared from 1950 to 1967. It's interesting that they stopped in 1967 because in the plot, the character himself was actually born in 1967. So if he was still alive, he'd be the same age as me. And he's obviously the chief pilot of the Interplanet Space Fleet, but he looks very much like he's still living in the 1950s in all of the illustrations, which shows that most of our future projections are really pretty much based on current society. But it's a lovely toy. And moving on into the 1960s, this is the first game that I'm showing you that's made by Waddington's, and a huge percentage of our toy collection really is our wonderful Waddington's archive. And we have toys and jigsaws and board games and card games that relate to pretty much any subject under the sun. It's an absolutely fantastic collection. And this obviously is the Stingray TV series created by Jerry and Sylvia Anderson, which first launched on ATV in 1964, and these puzzles were produced in that same year. And we couldn't really do a display of science fiction toys without including one of the most iconic items relating to children's science fiction, and this Dalek toy from the BBC Doctor Who series dates from 1974. And moving on, again, we have a lot of toys that are actually sort of also movie tie-ins, which is another theme that has come out in these displays. And these are a number of toys that were produced in the USA by Kenner Park Toys, related to the launch of the Ghostbusters film in 1987. And this particular one has a tin of what they call ectoplasm, but I think this is basically a version of what I grew up with in the 1970s as tins of slime, which is one toy that I was never allowed. And coming again further into the 1980s, there were a huge number of toys that were really connected with and tie-ins with TV cartoon series aimed at children. And some of these are very sort of traditionally macho, such as the Masters of the Universe, but possibly in response to this, there was also a series of She-Ra, which was aimed at girls and sort of empowering girls. So the action figure on the left dates from 1984 and represents the character called Double Trouble. It's actually donated by Kate Fellows, who's our learning manager, and she says, "I remember She-Ra vividly. I watched the cartoons, read the books, and asked for all the toys for birthday and Christmas. I remember thinking it was good to have a strong female in the leading role. It made sense to me. My mum and my grandmum's mum were both very strong, determined women. However, looking back with hindsight and the view of 2021, whilst She-Ra was a good start, there are many feminist aspects that were missing from the storylines. Each of the She-Ra figures would come with a little paper storybook. One side was in English, the other was in French. I really enjoyed flicking between each story and seeing what words I could recognise in the French side." And another aspect really of sort of a development of this sort of idea of sort of science fiction also played a lot into the development of console and video games and games that you could play on your TV. And this is an example from 1982 called Astro Wars. And it was made by a company called Grandstand Leisure Products, who were based in Harrogate. And we also know, we have the receipt for this, so we know that it was bought at Toyland in Otley. So this slide shows another aspect of children's culture in the 20th century, and that's really that a lot of things that are sort of quite anthropomorphic. We have a lot of toys that are based around animals, but a small number that also go beyond that. And one of my favourites that I did a lot of research on it in lockdown is Alfie Apple. And Alfie Apple was a cartoon series that appeared in Leeds Mercury. The stories were created by Mary McClure and they were illustrated by Thack. Mary McClure went under the pen name of Auntie Joan. So we have an annual here and a board game called Hiking in Fruit Town, and basically it's full of characters based on fruit. So Alfie Apple and Bertie Banana are the main characters, but they have a lot of friends. And this idea sort of also continues with ideas such as the Munch Bunch. And this is another sort of very popular cartoon, sort of, again, anthropomorphizing slightly unlikely things. A cartoon series created by Joe Driscoll in 1987, which was, I think, broadcast on TVM, is based on the idea that shoes reflect the character of their owners, so they might actually be little personalities in their own right. So basically these are all shoes as characters. But obviously a huge number of our toys are based around animals. I think animals, obviously they're very popular with children, they're very approachable for children, and they do get sometimes around some of the more difficult aspects around a sort of representation of people as well, because they're a bit more neutral. This is part of a collection from the 1930s of cast metal animals you could buy. They were, of course, covered in lead paint, which was poisonous, but you could get lots of little sets of lead animals, and these are made by W. Britain Limited London, who is one of the main manufacturers of lead figures, obviously toy soldiers and animals and all sorts of things. And some of these animal characters, again coming back more onto anthropomorphic animals, have a very long longevity. And this is Rupert Bear, and we have started off as a cartoon series in the Daily Express, and there was a club that you could be a member of. So this belonged to Joyce Rhodes, who was a member from 1933. And the rubber vinyl doll dates from the late 1960s and probably once had a squeak. So this slide shows the famous characters of Sooty and Sweep, who were characters created by Harry Corbett, who was originally from Bradford, but did work for Leeds City Council before he made his break in show business with the Sooty Show. And these puppets are both made by Chad Valley, so you could have your own puppet show with Sooty and Sweep. We still don't have a puppet for Sue, so we are on the lookout for that. And this can go into quite strange areas. I certainly myself find My Little Pony a little bit sinister, but was again there was a huge array of cartoons and toys and collectible toys based around My Little Pony from the 1980s onwards. And they are usually in some version of pink, purple, or other slightly fluorescent colours. So just changing tack again, we have a lovely little collection of different representations of football, and how to actually, toy manufacturers always try to sort of create games around something that's otherwise very physical and outdoors, and recreate that somehow as a card game, which is basically from about the 1920s or 1930s. One of the most famous sort of recreations of sort of indoor football is Subbuteo, which was very popular in the mid-20th century, and the company, although they were based in Tunbridge, Wales, were taken over by Waddington's in 1971. So we have quite a lot of examples, and this little VIP Cup presentation set was from 1973, which of course was actually the year that Leeds United won the cup. But again, it's nice to have found this edition of Mandy, which was a little paper aimed at girls, but again it shows that girls also were involved, very interested in football, and could win at blow football. So this is another example of the Waddington's games that we've included, and one of the reasons we've included this particular edition, this is Spy Ring from 1965, is that it features as an advertisement that a TV advertisement that the Yorkshire Film Archive have a copy of, and one of the things that we are able to include in the new display is a compilation of films looking at different aspects of childhood across the 20th century from the Yorkshire Film Archive, and it includes the advert for Spy Ring and for a couple of other Waddington's games. But just finishing off, there are a few games that I just included because I love them and that they actually make me laugh. And I think it's a real shame to me that the magnets in this game no longer work, because I would love to enjoy Magnetic Mirth playing Spilly Wobble. I think I would be very bad at it. This dates from about 1930. And a final confession, this edition of Waddington's game Slam is included purely for nostalgia from my own childhood. It was actually produced in the year that I was born, in 1967, but I remember playing it as a sort of 5-6-year-old, probably a little older, with my younger sister. And it was a very vicious game, and I have a physical memory of that little plastic cup sort of landing hard on my fingers, because the idea was you had to try and catch people's mice before they were able to pull them away. And as I said, it's one of those things that I have a really visceral memory of. So thank you very much for listening. And obviously we're still in a time of COVID, so please do keep safe. We purchased this Playmobil model, which seems to represent a little window onto this very strange year. I don't know whether their nurse always had a bottle of disinfectant and a mask. It does seem very appropriate. Thank you for listening.